When I first bought the property, the last thing on my mind was the road. Most people worry about the house itself, the roof, the plumbing, the foundation. And I did too, of course. But tucked into the fine print of my deed was something else, something unusual. The gravel lane that wound past my house, stretching out toward the cul-de-sac at the end of the neighborhood, technically belonged to me. It wasn't a secret. The realtor mentioned it briefly, flipping through paperwork with the casual tone of someone who assumed I wouldn't care. This portion of the road was originally part of the larger parcel, she said, and it's deeded to your property. The HOA maintains it for appearances, but technically it's yours. I remember nodding at the time, filing the detail away as trivia. Who cared who owned a strip of pavement? As long as it was there to drive on, I would learn very quickly that the HOA cared. For the first few weeks after I moved in, everything was quiet. The neighborhood presented itself the way all HOA-controlled developments do. Pristine lawns trimmed to regulation length, flower beds bursting with approved seasonal colors, identical mailboxes lined like soldiers along the curb. Everything looked perfect, and yet everything felt staged, like a movie set where one wrong move might reveal the cardboard behind the paint. The board members introduced themselves within days of my arrival. They didn't come bearing cookies or welcome baskets. They came with clipboards, surveys, and rehearsed smiles. Their questions weren't friendly. They were inspections disguised as conversation. Was I aware of the lawn restrictions? Did I understand the trash collection schedule? Did I have pets? And if so, would they be properly licensed and leashed? I answered politely, but their tone set the stage. They weren't neighbors. They were wardens. Still, I played along. At first, it all shifted the morning I stepped out to grab my mail and found a notice taped to the side of my box. The paper was stamped with the HOA's seal in bold red ink. Attention, road access and maintenance. The letter claimed that the board had recently voted to assume full jurisdiction over the road leading to my house. From that point forward, all decisions regarding the lane, repairs, parking, speed limits, usage, would be at their discretion. They had even declared the road to be common property, citing community necessity as their justification. I stood there in disbelief. They had voted to take something they didn't own, not asked, not negotiated, not even notified, me in advance. They had simply declared it theirs, like medieval lords seizing land. The arrogance was breathtaking. I pulled out my deed that evening, scanning through the legal descriptions. There it was in black and white. The boundaries, the parcel map, the explicit statement that the road belonged to my property. My property. Not theirs. It wasn't even ambiguous. That's when I realized the truth. The HOA's power didn't come from what they owned. It came from intimidation. They relied on residents being too timid, too compliant, or too exhausted to challenge them. If they said a rule was law, most people obeyed, whether it was legally binding or not. They thrived on silence. And I had just discovered the one piece of leverage they never expected anyone to notice: the road. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a clerical mistake. Maybe the board had overlooked the deed. Surely, once I showed them the paperwork, they would back off. But deep down, I already knew better. Power like theirs didn't retreat when confronted with facts. It dug in. It fought harder. And soon enough, they proved me right. 2 days later, a bright orange cone appeared in the middle of the road outside my house. Beside it, a sign planted. Into the gravel read, HOA Permit. Parking only. I stared at it, stunned. Not only had they claimed the road, but they were already monetizing it. That evening, I noticed cars lining the edges of the lane, vehicles belonging to households. That didn't even live near me. The HOA had begun renting out spaces on my road, pocketing the fees as if it were their private lot. The audacity was staggering. Neighbors shuffled by, pretending not to notice the confrontation building. But James, the quiet man who lived 3 houses down, shook his head as he walked his dog past my porch. He leaned closer and muttered under his breath, "They've been doing this for years. You're the first one with proof." I didn't answer him, but his words solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a system of control that had gone unchecked for too long. The next week brought escalation. More signs, more cones, painted lines across the gravel as though they had the right to turn my road into their private parking lot. Notices, taped to doors warning residents not to block community lanes. The HOA spoke as though the road had always belonged to them, rewriting history by sheer force of confidence. But every evening I sat at my dining table studying the paperwork, the deed, the survey maps, the county records. The law was clear, and I had the patience to wield it. The question wasn't whether I could stop them. The question was how far they were willing to push me before I did. By the time I reached the end of that first month, I had my answer. I came home one evening to find a fresh letter taped to my door. This one wasn't just a notice. It was a demand, effective immediately. All residents, including me, would be required to purchase monthly parking passes for use of HOA-controlled roadways. Failure to comply would result in fines of up to $500. The sheer gall of it almost made me laugh. They had taken my road, declared it theirs, and now they were demanding that I pay them to use it. To drive to my own home. That was the moment I stopped wondering if I should fight back and started planning how, because if the HOA thought they could steal my road, they had no idea what I was capable of taking from them in return. And soon enough, their cars, the pride of their polished driveways, the symbols of their control, would be the first to vanish. The moment I read the notice demanding that I pay the HOA for a parking pass to use my own road, something in me hardened. Before that, I had been angry, yes, frustrated, annoyed. But this was different. This was the moment the HOA crossed from arrogance into outright theft, and I wasn't about to let it stand. The neighborhood woke up the next morning to fresh rows of signs hammered into the ground along the lane. Bold white letters on deep green backgrounds declared HOA parking. Only. Trespassers will be fined. The signs were polished, professional, clearly ordered from a manufacturer weeks in advance. This wasn't spontaneous overreach. This was planned. It wasn't just signs either. Overnight, the board had painted thick yellow stripes on the gravel road, crudely marking official spaces and numbering them. Each number corresponded to a spot on the HOA's new parking allocation system, a spreadsheet they circulated by email. Families who had already paid for permits were assigned spaces directly outside my property. Cars lined up like trophies, blocking sight lines, cluttering the quiet lane that had once been peaceful. The HOA had turned my road into their cash register. At first, neighbors grumbled quietly. Some were annoyed by the fees, others irritated by the inconvenience of being forced to park further from their homes. But the board silenced dissent with a single threat: fines. They had fined so many people for so many petty infractions that the neighborhood was conditioned like clockwork to obey. But I wasn't one of them. I started documenting everything. I photographed every new sign, every cone, every car parked in what was legally mine. I recorded timestamps, license plates, even the emails the board sent out. My folder grew thicker by the day. Still, the pettiness didn't stop. One evening, as I pulled into the lane, I found my own driveway partially blocked. A shiny SUV, adorned with the HOA decal, sat across the edge of my gravel, making it impossible to enter without scraping the side of my car. I laid on the horn, waiting for someone to appear. After 5 minutes, a board member strolled out casually, twirling keys in his hand. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge the inconvenience. He simply slid into the driver's seat, reversed a few feet, and smirked as he drove away. The message was clear. They were flexing, testing, seeing how far they could push me before I broke. But what they didn't know was that each of these moments only fueled my resolve. They thought they were cornering me. In reality, they were giving me ammunition. The breaking point came a week later. I woke up early, planning to run errands before the road filled with cars. But when I stepped outside, I froze. Fresh paint streaked across the gravel, bright white letters spelling out, "Reserved, HOA board only." They had designated the spaces directly in front of my property for themselves. Their cars now sat parked proudly across the lane, gleaming in the morning. Sun as though daring me to challenge their claim. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a declaration of war. Neighbors noticed, too. James stopped by that evening, shaking his head. "They're getting reckless," he muttered. "Nobody's ever pushed back before, so they think they're untouchable." He paused, glancing at the line of board member cars blocking the road. "But they don't know you, do they?" I didn't answer him then. But the truth was, James was right. The board thought this was business as usual. Another resident to intimidate, another household to control. They had no idea I had been quietly preparing my counterattack. For years, they had used fear as their weapon. But fear cuts both ways. And soon, they were going to learn what it felt like to lose something they depended on. I started with research. Long nights spent combing, through county records, property maps, and local ordinances. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Not only did the HOA not own the road, they had no legal grounds to regulate it. Their parking scheme wasn't just unfair, it was fraud. Every dollar they collected, every fine they issued, was a violation of property law. The realization electrified me. I didn't just have a defense, I had leverage. I began making calls, first to the county zoning office, then to a lawyer friend who specialized in real estate disputes. With every conversation, my confidence grew. The law wasn't on the HOA's side, it was on mine. But I didn't want to just fight them in court. I wanted to dismantle their power in a way they couldn't recover from. And to do that, I needed to hit them where it hurt. The cars. Those polished vehicles were more than transportation. They were status symbols, proof of success, the pride of board members who spent weekends waxing and polishing them. They parked them in my lane like trophies, flaunting their control. What they didn't realize was that by placing their cars on my property, they had handed me the perfect weapon, because on paper those cars weren't just parked illegally, they were trespassing. And trespassing vehicles on private property, the law gave me every right to have them removed. Quietly, I started making arrangements. I spoke with a local towing company, carefully explaining the situation. At first, they hesitated. Nobody wanted to cross an HOA, but once I showed them the deed and county records, their tone shifted. If the cars were on my land, I had full authority to call them in. The plan was forming. The evidence was stacked. The law was on my side. All that remained was timing. For days I waited, biding my time as the board grew bolder. They strutted past my porch, parking their gleaming cars directly in front of my house, laughing loudly as though daring me to protest. They had no idea that each rev of their engines brought them closer to their undoing. One evening I stood at my window watching the sun set over the road. The board's vehicles gleamed in the fading light, lined neatly like pawns on a chessboard. And for the first time, I allowed myself a small smile. They thought they had taken my road. But soon, I was going to take their cars. And when those vehicles vanished, so too would the illusion of control the HOA had built their power upon. Every war has a moment when the tide turns, when the oppressed stop cowering and the oppressor feels the first ripple of fear. For me, that moment came under the cover of night, on a road that technically belonged to me but had been claimed by the HOA as their personal parking lot. For weeks, I had endured the sight of their vehicles lined up outside my house like trophies, gleaming SUVs, polished sedans. a luxury coupe that one board member babied like a child. They parked them arrogantly, side by side, flaunting their control, as though their presence on my land was proof of their dominion. They thought their cars were untouchable. But that night I reminded them what ownership really meant. The plan had been carefully crafted. I had spoken at length with the towing company, ensuring every piece of paperwork was airtight. The owner, a grizzled man named Carl, had seen plenty of HOA disputes in his day. At first, he hesitated, worried about the fallout. But once I laid the deed across his desk, tracing the boundary lines with my finger, he nodded slowly. "Son," he said, "if they're parked on your property, then those cars are trespassing. And trespassing cars, they vanish. We set the date. We set the time." The board, in their arrogance, made it easy. Friday nights were their ritual. They held meetings that were little more than thinly disguised social hours. They'd gather at the community center, drink overpriced wine, and boast about property values while their cars sat proudly in front of my house. They never worried about their vehicles because they believed fear kept me compliant. They had no idea I had traded fear for fury. At exactly 9:30 p.m., the first tow truck rolled quietly into the lane. Its lights were dimmed, its engine a low hum against the night air. I stepped outside to meet Carl, paperwork in hand. He glanced at the row of cars, then back at me and smirked. "Let's get to work." The first hook latched onto the SUV belonging to the tall man, the board president himself. The vehicle rocked slightly as the winch pulled it onto the flatbed. The sound of metal chains clinking echoed in the night, a quiet symphony of justice. I felt my pulse quicken, not with nerves, but with exhilaration. One by one, the trucks arrived, each backed into position, each securing a vehicle with practiced ease. The luxury coupe was loaded carefully, its gleaming paint catching the moonlight as it disappeared down the road. The smug sedan that always blocked part of my driveway was next, dragged away like a stubborn child being hauled from a tantrum. By midnight, the lane was empty. For the first time since moving in, I could see the gravel stretch unobstructed in front of my property. No cones, no signs, no board member vehicles daring me to object. Just silence, just freedom. And the best part? It was all legal. Carl handed me the paperwork, each tow slip neatly signed. "They'll be calling in the morning," he said, chuckling. "And when they do, they'll find out they've got a hefty bill to pay to get their cars back." I thanked him, tucking the documents into my folder. Every detail was recorded, every step within my rights as the property owner. If the board wanted a fight, they had just lost their opening battle in spectacular fashion. The next morning, the neighborhood erupted. Shouts echoed down the lane as the board discovered their missing vehicles. I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, pretending to read the paper as they stormed up and down the road. Their faces were pale with disbelief, twisted with rage. Phones were pressed to ears, fingers jabbed at the empty spaces where their cars had once sat. I watched as the tall man barked orders, pacing furiously. The sunglasses woman threw her hands into the air, shrieking loud enough for the whole block to hear. The scowling man kicked at the gravel, his anger spilling over in childish frustration. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their curiosity undeniable. Whispers spread like wildfire. What had happened? Where had the cars gone? Who had the nerve to do this? It didn't take long for the board to reach my door. They marched up my walkway, pounding on the wood like a police raid. I set my coffee down carefully, opened the door just enough to meet their eyes, and waited. The tall man's voice shook with fury. "Where are our cars?" I raised an eyebrow, my tone calm, deliberate. "Do you mean the cars that were trespassing on my property?" His face reddened. "You had no right—" "Actually," I interrupted, holding up the deed, "I had every right. This road is mine. The vehicles were illegally parked here. I exercised my legal right to remove them. You'll find the tow slips filed with the county if you'd like confirmation. The silence that followed was delicious. The sunglasses woman sputtered, pointing a trembling finger. "This is harassment. You can't—" "I can," I said firmly. "And I will, every time you or anyone else parks on my land without permission. The law's on my side." "Maybe you should have read the deed before claiming what wasn't yours." The scowling man muttered threats under his breath, but I didn't flinch. I simply closed the door, leaving them fuming on my porch. By the end of the day, the story had spread through the entire neighborhood. Some residents were horrified. Others were quietly thrilled. For years, they had endured the board's heavy hand, paying fines and obeying rules without question. Now, someone had stood up to them, and won. The board retrieved their cars eventually, though not without humiliation. They had to pay the towing fees out of pocket, hundreds of dollars each, and the vehicles were released only after signing paperwork acknowledging the trespass. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but symbolically, it was monumental. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the untouchable authority. They were the ones scrambling, the ones paying, the ones forced to swallow their pride. But I knew better than to think it was over. The board wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. They would retaliate. They would scheme. They would plot ways to claw back their control, and when they did, I would be ready, because I hadn't just removed their cars that night. I had removed their illusion of invincibility. And once fear breaks, it never comes back the same. I knew the board wouldn't take the humiliation quietly. People like them, drunk on authority, addicted to control, don't just roll over after a defeat. They double down. They lash out. They come back louder, bolder, and more desperate to prove that their power hasn't slipped. And true to form, less than 48 hours after the tow trucks carried off their precious vehicles, the HOA struck back. It started with paper. One morning, I opened my mailbox to find it stuffed with envelopes, each stamped with the HOA's gaudy logo. Inside, violation notices, half a dozen of them, each citing some absurd rule I had supposedly broken: improper lawn maintenance, unapproved exterior color scheme, unauthorized modifications to property. They even fined me for obstructing the natural flow of neighborhood harmony. Whatever that meant. It was laughable on the surface, but I knew what it really was. Retaliation, intimidation, their attempt to remind me that they still had teeth. I laid the stack of papers neatly on my kitchen table and smiled. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. Every baseless fine, every petty accusation was another nail in their coffin. Evidence of abuse of power, proof of harassment. But the HOA wasn't finished. The next day, a fresh round of signs appeared. No trespassing. HOA authorized. Personnel only. They weren't just on the road this time. They were staked at the edge of my yard as though trying to extend their imaginary empire onto my land. I pulled one of the signs out of the ground, held it up for the neighbors to see, and laughed out loud. "Bold move," I muttered, tossing it onto the growing pile of documentation. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. People whispered when I passed, some wide-eyed with admiration, others wary of the chaos brewing. A few even stopped by my porch, under the guise of friendly conversation, eager to know the truth about the towing, the fines, the escalating battle. Most were tired of the board's tyranny, tired of the endless fees, the absurd rules, the constant fear of punishment. My pushback had lit a spark in them, though many were too cautious to fan the flames just yet. The board, meanwhile, grew bolder by the day. They scheduled an emergency meeting, plastering notices on every door in the neighborhood. The language was laughably dramatic. Urgent community crisis. Unauthorized actions threatening the safety and order of our neighborhood. Translation: they were furious I had beaten them at their own game. I attended, of course. Not because I wanted to listen to their posturing, but because I wanted to watch them squirm. The community center buzzed with tension that night. Folding chairs lined the room, every seat filled with residents. At the front sat the board, the tall man, the sunglasses woman, the scowling man, and a couple of others who usually lurked in the background but had been dragged out for reinforcement. The tall man stood first, slamming his hand on the table. "Neighbors," he began, his voice dripping with forced authority, "we are under attack. One resident has taken extreme and unlawful measures against the HOA, endangering the integrity of our community." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others rolled their eyes. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, enjoying the show. The sunglasses woman adjusted her frames dramatically. "This behavior cannot be tolerated. Cars were stolen, legally towed," I corrected loudly, my voice carrying across the room. "On my property, at my expense, with county approval. Would you like to see the paperwork?" Gasps and whispers exploded through the crowd. The tall man's face flushed crimson. "You see," he shouted, "this is what we're dealing with. A rogue element who refuses to follow the rules we've all agreed to live by." "Correction again," I said calmly. "Rules you invented. Rules you enforce selectively. Rules that have nothing to do with the law and everything to do with your obsession with control." The room erupted. Some residents clapped, others hissed. But one thing was clear. The board was losing its grip. The scowling man leaned forward, jabbing a finger at me. "We can fine you into bankruptcy if we have to," I smiled. "And I can sue you for harassment, abuse of power, and fraud. I wonder how your personal finances will look after that." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The board sputtered, scrambling to recover, but the damage was done. Their threats no longer carried the same weight. The audience wasn't cowed. They were intrigued. That was the night. I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The neighbors were watching closely, some even rooting for me. The board's mask of authority had cracked, and once a crack forms, it spreads. But the HOA, stubborn as ever, wasn't done trying to claw back control. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of hammers. I stepped outside to find workers, installing a metal gate across the road, complete with a keypad entry system. The board stood nearby, supervising like generals on a battlefield. The tall man barked orders, while the sunglasses woman snapped photos of the construction. I walked, over arms folded. "You realize that's illegal, right?" the tall man sneered. "We're securing community property." I laughed. "Community property? You mean my road?" he smirked. "Not for long." That line told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just retaliating, they were escalating into a full-blown land grab. I snapped photos, recorded, video, and filed yet another complaint with the county. But even as I documented their latest stunt, I knew I couldn't just play defense. The HOA had declared war in broad daylight, and if they wanted a war, I was going to give them one they couldn't survive. The new gate was the boldest move yet. Overnight, the HOA had turned my road into a fortress, complete with keypad entry, steel posts cemented into the gravel, and a chain-link barrier stretching across the width of the lane. It gleamed under the morning sun, a symbol of defiance, as if the board had decided that sheer audacity could erase the fact that the land wasn't theirs. To most residents, the sight was intimidating. To me, it was laughable. I stood at the edge of my driveway, coffee mug in hand, watching the board members gloat as the final bolts were tightened. The tall man supervised like a dictator inspecting his army. The sunglasses woman strutted around, snapping photos with her phone as though documenting a historic triumph. The scowling man leaned against his car. Yes, he'd dared to park just outside the new gate, smirking at me with open contempt. They thought they'd won. They thought they had finally cornered me. But all I saw was evidence of illegal construction on my land, evidence of fraud, evidence that would dismantle them piece by piece. "Quite a structure," I called out, raising my mug in a mock salute. The tall man turned, his grin smug. You'll need a code to pass through now. Only authorized residents get access. Authorized. By who? I asked. By us? The sunglasses woman said sharply, lowering her phone just long enough to sneer. The HOA, I laughed. Not the nervous laugh of someone afraid, but the kind of laugh that makes people's skin prickle because it carries confidence. Fascinating, because according to the county records, the only person authorized to control this road is me. Their smiles faltered, if only for a second. Then the scowling man waved dismissively. Good luck proving that in court. Oh, I will, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and snapping a photo of the gate. And when I do, I hope you're ready to explain to the judge why you spent community funds building something on private property. That shut them up. But silence didn't mean surrender. The gate stood, and with it, a new level of hostility. Neighbors were furious. Some couldn't access their homes without waiting for board approval. Delivery trucks were turned away unless they registered with the HOA. One family returning from vacation was forced to sit in their driveway for an hour while the board verified their residency. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. Always control. The neighborhood buzzed with anger. Whispered conversations grew louder, more open. People were fed up, and for the first time their frustration wasn't directed at me for rocking the boat. It was aimed squarely at the board. I realized I had an opportunity. That night, I invited a handful of neighbors over. James came along, with the young couple from 2 houses down and a retired teacher named Mrs. Daniels who'd lived in the community for decades. We sat around my kitchen table, the folder of evidence spread wide. This, I said, tapping the photo of the gate, is illegal. They don't own the road. They don't have the authority to build on it. And they definitely don't have the right to restrict your access to your own homes. Mrs. Daniels sighed, her voice heavy with years of frustration. They've been pushing people around for so long, most of us just gave up fighting. But this... She shook her head. This is too far. The young couple exchanged glances, then nodded. We're in, the husband said. Whatever you're planning, we'll help. That was the moment it shifted from me against the HOA to us against the HOA. With allies at my side, the next step was clear. Dismantle the gate. Not physically, at least not yet, but legally, strategically, in a way that stripped the board of any defense. The following morning, I filed an official complaint with the county zoning office, complete with photos, maps, and property records. I highlighted every violation: unlawful construction, obstruction of private property, misuse of community funds. Then, I called the local paper. By the end of the week, a reporter was standing on my road, snapping photos of the gleaming new gate, while I explained the situation on record. They've overstepped their authority, I told her, keeping my tone calm, measured. This isn't about community safety, it's about power, and it's about time someone stood up to them. When the article ran 2 days later, it hit. The neighborhood, like a thunderclap, local HOA faces backlash over illegal gate. Neighbors clipped the story, shared it online, whispered about it over fences and in driveways. The board scrambled to contain the damage, sending out panicked emails insisting the article was misinformed and biased. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The tall man knocked on my door that evening, his face a mask of forced calm. You didn't have to go to the press, he said. Oh, I did, I replied smoothly. Because you didn't have to build a gate across my road. His jaw clenched. This isn't over. I leaned against the door frame, meeting his glare with a steady gaze. You're right. It's just getting started. Behind him, I could see neighbors standing on porches watching. The board was losing its grip, and everyone knew it. The county investigation was the final blow. Inspectors came out, clipboards in hand, documenting every detail of the gate. They measured, photographed, and shook their heads grimly as they compared the construction to the property lines on the deed. Within a week, the county issued a formal order. The gate had to come down. Immediately. When the notice hit the board's inbox, the neighborhood exploded with laughter and applause. People cheered in the streets as workers dismantled the structure, piece by piece, hauling away the metal and concrete like the ruins of a toppled empire. The board members, red-faced and humiliated, tried to spin it as a voluntary removal for community unity. But nobody bought it. Everyone knew the truth. They'd been caught, exposed, defeated. And for me, watching from my porch with a satisfied smile, it was more than just a victory. It was a turning point, because the gate hadn't just fallen. The illusion of the HOA's invincibility had fallen with it. When the gate came down, the neighborhood cheered. But not everyone was smiling. The HOA board didn't vanish into the rubble. They regrouped, they plotted, and soon they launched their next desperate strategy: divide and conquer. If they couldn't control me directly, they'd try to turn my neighbors into weapons. It started quietly. James mentioned it first. "Got a letter yesterday," he said, leaning against my porch rail. "HOA claims you're driving down property values. Said your reckless behavior is making the neighborhood unstable." I raised an eyebrow. "Did they now?" He smirked. "They don't know me very well, do they?" But James wasn't the only one. Within days, several residents told me the same thing. The board had circulated a flyer, disguised as a community notice, painting me as a dangerous troublemaker. According to their propaganda, I was a threat to neighborhood harmony, a rogue element undermining years of progress. They warned that siding with me could lead to increased scrutiny from county officials and potential financial risk. In other words, fear. They wanted my neighbors to believe that my fight would cost them, that siding with me was siding against their own security. It was a clever move, I had to admit, but it was also cowardly. The real kicker came at the next board meeting. I attended, of course. By now, showing up had become part of my strategy, and sure enough, the tall man wasted no time framing me as the villain. "Neighbors," he declared dramatically, "we all saw what happened with the gate. We understand the confusion, but what you may not know is that this resident," he pointed at me, "has been actively working to undermine the HOA at every turn. His actions threaten not just our authority, but your homes, your families, your property values." A murmur swept the room. Some residents frowned. Others looked skeptical. The sunglasses woman leaned forward, her voice sharp. "If he keeps stirring trouble, the county could increase taxes, or worse, restrict neighborhood improvements. Is that what you want?" I stood calmly, letting them have their say before I raised my hand. "May I?" I asked. The tall man glared, but he couldn't refuse, not in front of a room full of residents. I stepped forward, holding up a folder. "Everything they've told you tonight is a lie. The gate, illegal, the parking scheme, fraudulent, the fines they've handed out for years. Unenforceable. I have the documents to prove it." Gasps and whispers spread. I opened the folder, pulling out copies of county notices, property records, even the article from the local paper. "This isn't about me being reckless," I continued. "This is about them abusing power, about them taking your money, your freedom, and your trust, and using it to build their little empire." The scowling man slammed his fist on the table. "Lies!" he barked. I smiled. "If it's lies, then why did the county order your precious gate removed? Why did you have to pay towing fees to get your cars back from my road? Why are residents fined hundreds of dollars for things that aren't even in the bylaws?" The silence that followed was golden. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. For years, they'd grumbled privately but never dared speak out. Now, confronted with evidence, the cracks widened. Mrs. Daniels, sitting near the back, stood slowly. "He's right," she said firmly. "I've lived here 30 years, And in that time, I've paid thousands in fines for nonsense, for leaving a garden hose out, for planting the wrong kind of flowers. I'm tired of it." The young couple nodded. "We are too," the husband said. "The HOA has overstepped for years. Maybe it's time someone did something about it." The board members exchanged nervous glances. Their strategy was unraveling in real time, but they weren't done yet. The next morning, new signs appeared around the neighborhood. "Stand with the HO. Protect our community." It was laughable. But alongside the signs came whispers, rumors carefully planted by the board. They claimed I was suing the neighborhood as a whole, that I was working with developers to buy up property, that I was planning to demolish homes and build apartments. None of it was true, of course. But fear doesn't care about truth. Fear spreads faster than facts. For a few days, I felt the shift. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations hushed when I walked by. The board had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt. But seeds only grow if they're watered, and I wasn't about to let lies take root. I doubled down on transparency. Every document I filed, every letter I received, every update from the county, I shared copies with my neighbors. I invited them into my home, laid the evidence on the table, answered every question honestly. Slowly, the tide shifted back. By the end of the week, more people were knocking on my door than avoiding it. They were curious, angry, ready to talk. The board had tried to divide us. Instead, they had pushed us together. I realized something important then. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The neighborhood had seen too much, endured too much. They were ready for change, and the board, for all their bluster, was running out of moves. But I also knew desperate people are dangerous. The HOA had lost their cars, lost their gate, lost their ability to silence me. Their last weapon was fear, and now even that was slipping, which meant their next move would be reckless, and reckless enemies are the easiest to defeat. When you corner a predator, it doesn't retreat peacefully. It thrashes, it snaps, it lashes out in one final desperate attempt to claw back control. That's exactly what the HOA did. For weeks, they'd been losing ground. Cars towed, gate demolished, neighbors waking up to the truth. Their lies were unraveling, their authority crumbling. And yet, instead of backing down gracefully, they decided to go nuclear. It started with the police. One Tuesday morning, I opened my door to find two officers standing on my porch. Their hands rested casually on their belts, but their eyes carried the weight of annoyance. "Sir, we received a complaint," one said. "The HOA claims you've been harassing board members, trespassing on community property, and threatening residents." I almost laughed. "Community property?" I held up the deed, already prepared. "This road is mine. And as for harassment, I've got folders of evidence showing it's the other way around." The officers flipped through my documents, frowns, deepening with each page. When they left, they offered a polite nod. "Looks like you're in the clear. But word of advice, keep everything documented. They'll probably keep pushing." I didn't need the advice. My documentation was already airtight. The board thought they could weaponize law enforcement against me. Instead, they handed me even more proof of their harassment. But that was only their opening move. A week later, I woke to find spray-painted words across my driveway. Troublemaker. Childish, sloppy, and yet powerful in its intent. It wasn't about vandalism. It was about intimidation. A message. "We're watching you." I didn't scrub it off right away. Instead, I photographed it from every angle, time-stamped, then called the police to file a report. When the officer asked if I suspected anyone, I simply handed him a folder marked HOA Retaliation. By the time I finished, the scowling man was pacing nervously on his porch across the street. But even that wasn't the board's lowest point. No, their final play came at the next community meeting. The tall man stood before the residents, voice booming with fake concern. "Neighbors, we are at a crossroads. This individual," he pointed at me, "is destroying the very fabric of our community. We must take a vote. Effective immediately, we propose raising HOA dues to create a legal defense fund to protect ourselves against his attacks." The sunglasses woman chimed in, her voice shrill. "If we don't act, property values will plummet. Our neighborhood will fall apart." The scowling man added, "We can't let one person dictate how we live." Their performance was desperate, theatrical, and dripping with fear. I let them speak. I let the panic wash through the room. Then, when the murmurs quieted, I stood. "May I asked, voice calm. The tall man sneered. "You've said enough." "Then why is everyone here staring at me instead of you?" I asked. The silence was deafening. I pulled out my folder, my weapon, my shield, and laid it on the table. "Here's what the board hasn't told you. The cars, towed legally, the gate, ordered down by the county. The police already know who's harassing who. And now they want you, the residents, to pay for their mistakes, out of your pockets, for their fraud." I held up the latest county notice, stamped and signed. "This document proves the board acted outside their authority, which means every dollar they spent on that gate, misuse of funds, every fine they've issued over fake rules, fraud, every threat they've made, harassment." Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide. The board shifted uncomfortably. I drove the final nail. "They want more money. But here's the truth. If you join me, if you stand up, we can dissolve this board. Strip them of their power. End the cycle of fear once and for all." The room erupted. Not with applause, not yet, but with chatter. Heated, excited, uncertain. Some shouted support, others demanded answers. But one thing was clear. The board's grip was slipping beyond repair. The tall man slammed his fist on the table, shouting for order. But his voice no longer carried authority. It carried desperation. That night, I walked home to murmurs of, "He's right," echoing down the street. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now nodded in quiet solidarity. The tide had turned. The HOA had made their desperate strike, and it had backfired spectacularly, because when a predator lashes out and misses, it shows weakness. And weakness, once revealed, can never be hidden again. I knew then. The board's days were numbered, and I was going to be the one to finish what they had started. Subscribe, like, and share my channel so you get the next video before anyone else.